Here in Palo Alto, there's a Ritz-Carlton, there's a Westin. Now imagine a guy who is a valet parking cars at the Ritz-Carlton here in Palo Alto. And this guy is paid, let's say, $15 an hour. And let's say that he works 10 hours a day, so he makes 150 bucks. And this guy is now thinking to myself, in those 10 hours, how many cars did I park? Well, I parked, let's say, 100 cars. And how much does the Ritz-Carlton charge for someone to park their car? $30. So how much should the Ritz-Carlton make as a result of me parking those 100 cars? $3,000. And how much was I paid out of that $3,000? $150. 3,000 minus 150 gives $2,850. Who gets that? So from the valet's point of view, this is a very unjust system because I'm doing the work and some other guy is taking the cash. And this argument about the injustice of capitalism is actually anchored in, I think, a rather interesting argument that was made by Marx himself. And so there's a big difference between the revenue generated by the sales and the cost. And that difference Marx calls surplus value. We call it profit. And Marx's question, quite a profound question, who gets that? Now Marx's assumption is that that belongs 100% to labor. Why? Because labor made the goods. The capitalists supplied nothing more than the money which has already been recompensed through interest. My view is that this description, convincing as it is on first glance, is a completely false representation of how businesses actually run. Consider for a moment the capitalist. In America today, the vast majority of capitalists supply a lot of things, but the one thing they do not supply is capital. Did Steve Jobs actually put up all the capital for Apple? No, he went to a bank. The bank supplied the capital. And this is true of Gates and everyone down the list. The bottom line of it, the capitalist supplies three things that Marx completely ignores, that are actually of far greater value than capital and actually entitle the capitalist to a share of the profit. But Marx, in a sense, submerges these three factors completely. First, the capitalist has the idea for the business. Without the idea, there's no business. Labor doesn't think of the idea, the capitalist does. It's his or her idea. They do it. Second, the capitalist organizes the business. Here you have this valet, he goes, I park the cars, I need all the money. The truth of it is the reason you're getting $30 to park a car is you're at the Ritz-Carlton. Somebody built the Ritz-Carlton, somebody thought of it, somebody paid all the capital costs, somebody took out the insurance. You didn't think of that. If you come to my house and want to park my car, I'll pay you 50 cents. So the reason that you're getting $30 is not because of you. It's not your labor that's worth $30. It's the resort that's worth $30. And you didn't create that. So the capitalist has the idea for it, he organizes it, and third, he takes all the risk. Very important factor. The capitalist gets paid at the end. If the business has a bad quarter, Steve Jobs can't go, or the current Tim Cook can't go to Apple and say, sorry guys, I'm not going to pay you for 6 months. It's looking bad for us this half of the year. No, he has to pay them anyway. So labor is trading a fixed wage for security. But the entrepreneur is taking the risk that he might get nothing out of it, and he could even lose money. So the truth of the matter is that in fairly assessing the just rewards of capitalism, you have to match what the entrepreneur actually contributes. And to say it's just capital, it seems to me, is a gross misunderstanding how business is actually conducted in the United States and all around the world.
Commandancy of the Alamo, Bear, February the 24th, 1836. To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character to come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. William Barrett Travis, Lieutenant Colonel, Commandant. That was the letter that was written, given to a young man by the name of Juan Seguin and delivered to Sam Houston. You all know the story about the Alamo. 13 days, 185 men stood there. That's where, when I went to the University of Tennessee, we earned our nickname as the Volunteers. But the thing that I want you to understand is that William Barrett Travis, when he wrote that incredible letter, was only 26 years of age. Same age as my daughter is right now, the oldest. I want you to have that exact same character, that exact same spirit, that exact same desire to stand and fight. Because when I look at where you are on these college campuses and university campuses all across the United States of America, it may seem like you are surrounded. It may seem like you have no hope whatsoever. It may seem like a desperate situation, but you've got to make a stand if you truly believe in this constitutional republic. I want you to have the exact same spirit of so many of our forefathers and foremothers, that they didn't sit back and wait for their time. They had it within their hearts. They knew what freedom meant. They knew what liberty stood for. And they said, I'll make my own stand. I want you to think about how in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, when Isaiah stood before the hosts of the Lord, and they said, whom shall we send? Who will go for us? I want each and every one of you to stand up and say, here am I. Send me.
How does the left get it precisely backward? The rot runs very deep. It runs all the way down to the core of leftist ideology itself, which is a preference for fantasy over reality. John F. Kennedy summed this up in one of the most famous lines of his presidency. It's a line that has been repeated by countless leftists since. Kennedy said, and he was quoting the socialist playwright George Bernard Shaw, he said, some people see things that are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not. This is supposed to be an inspiring line. And he acknowledges that the line comes from the socialist playwright George Bernard Shaw. He doesn't mention which play. The play is Back to Methuselah. That scene is the serpent in the Garden of Eden tempting Eve. Those are the words of the devil, this preference for fantasy over reality. It's amazing that they skip over that part. You'd think it's like an important detail. They don't do the reading on the left, so they just see the line from a quotation website or something. They don't realize the context. The embrace of fantasy is the temptation at the heart of leftism, which is a utopian ideology. Leftism believes in the perfectibility of human nature. Leftism believes in progress with a capital P, right there in the name, progressivism. According to progressivism, we are moving right along toward utopia, the perfect society, and the only people holding us back are those knuckle-dragging conservatives like all of us. They are impeding our perfect future. Every leftist ideology at its core has sought out this utopia, from the communist revolutions a century ago to the socialist states that we see around the world today. Ironically, the nearer the left has ever gotten toward its vision of paradise, the more closely their societies have resembled hell on earth. Because utopia is fantasy. Most people think that the word utopia means the best place. This is how it's taught in school. It doesn't. It literally means no place. You means no, topos means place. No place. This battle between fantasy and reality is being waged in our speech, which is why the left is so keen to control exactly what you say. Just last week, Colorado State University, I don't know if anybody here is from Colorado State, they published an inclusive language guide that banned, just by my own count, 131 words and phrases. The words included he, she, him, her, Mr., Mrs., and Ms., which I thought was woke, but it's not woke anymore. It banned the phrase hip, hip, hooray, because it says the phrase has Nazi origins. If you say hip, hip, hooray, you're now a Nazi, according to Colorado State. They even banned the word homosexual, which until 5 minutes ago was the politically correct term, in favor of the word queer, which 2 weeks ago almost got Steven Crowder kicked off of YouTube. The word queer, which we were told is like the N-word. Now that's the one that's in. Homosexual, which was PC, is now out. Very difficult to keep up. Here you see the end game of all of these speech codes. It is not about protecting any oppressed victim group. The left abandons their pet victim groups the moment that they cease to be politically useful. We're watching them abandon women right now in favor of men who wear dresses in real time. And this isn't about making our society any more civil either. You will never find a more scolding, vindictive person than a campus social justice warrior. Not very civil. One of them busted in a mask and sprayed my nice suit with a bunch of weird, glittery chemicals. Not very civil. They call all of their opponents Hitler. Have you noticed that? Everyone slightly to the right of them is Hitler. The end game of these speech codes is not even to get people to use particular words, because the words change every 2 seconds. What's woke 1 minute is politically incorrect and vicious and evil and bigoted the next. The purpose of these speech codes is to make people shut up altogether. It's to stop you from getting in the way of that inevitable march toward utopia. The purpose of the speech codes, the ever-expanding banned word lists, is to stop you from speaking, to make you check with the committee before every time you open your mouth. It reminds us of 1984. We mention 1984 in a lot of conservative speeches these days. I don't want it to be a cliche. The trouble is it's true. We're beginning to live in it. In 1984, Orwell wrote, "Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered." And the process is continuing day by day, minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right.
Ideologies don't change, people do. We are fighting for the heart and soul of our nation against socialism, Marxism, and the evil that it has brought to us in the stealing of our history. Karl Marx said it best, the author, the father of socialism, an atheist, anti-Semite, and a blatant racist. Yet we teach his philosophy in our school systems today. He said it, the first battleground is rewriting of our history. You steal our history, you steal our pride in our past, our appreciation for our present, and our vision for our future. And every single urban city in our country is now experiencing that loss. The history of our black country, of our black Americans, has been stolen from us for decades, almost over a century. Booker T. Washington, 1882, began Tuskegee University. By 1905, it was producing more self-made black millionaires than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined. The 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was a black community that led our country in the growth of the middle class, led our country in terms of men committed to marriage, over 70%, now it's 30%. Led our country in terms of the committed to business ownership, 40%, now it's 3.8%. Men matriculated from college. We now have a higher percentage of men incarcerated in college. It is, by the way, my degree was biology. And that, I learned a long time ago that slavery is not a gene in the DNA helix. It's our actions, it's our attitude, it's our belief. I do not believe in reparation, because what reparation does, it points to a certain race, a certain color, and it points them as evil, and points the other race, my race, as one that is not only becomes racist, but also beggars. I do believe in restitution. That way we can get past this reparation and recognize that this country has given us greatness. Look at this panel. It doesn't matter how we think. The fact is, well, it doesn't matter our color. We have become successful in this country like no other because of this great opportunity to live the American dream. Let's not steal that from our kids by telling them they can't do it.
Can you speak about your reparations testimony this week? How do you feel it was received both by members and other panelists?
What a good question. I think what's happening across our country, we need to have more black conservatives saying the things that white conservatives cannot say and feel comfortable with. You see, what the left loves to do is call people racist, and unfortunately, a lot of white people don't like to be called racist. I don't mind being called Uncle Tom and Coon and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't bother me at all. And it actually tells me that they've lost the battle because they're not debating anymore. They're calling names. So I feel really good that it's accepted as well as it was. It says to me that America, we're on the same page. We're tired of the leftists blaming us for all the things they have done in the past. If they want to talk about reparation, let's talk about restitution. Let's talk about getting repaid for all the misery they have brought to our country and our people, black and white, the lives lost because of hatred they brought into our system.
I'll just tell you something that my daughter said to me the other day, just off the cuff. She was on Facebook and she goes, I've just been going from one page to the other of all my friends, and my daughter's 24, so she's in that age group, all posting videos and sonograms of all their pregnancies in various stages of development. And she goes, and I read these effusive descriptions that go with these sonograms. I'm so excited, my baby is a boy, blah, 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 blah. Now, they're not thinking about abortion. They're just thinking about what's happening. And this is a very good indicator of truth because it's not politicized. These are people all across the spectrum, and not one of them goes, oh, you know, it's just a clump of cells. You know, one day it's going to be a baby, but it may, you know, I don't know, it could turn out to be a rat. I just don't know, but that moment of birth is going to be the moment of truth. No. All these people look and talk and act and behave as though they got a kid on the way. And it's nothing else. It is both life and it is human life. And it may be human life that needs to be geographically extricated from the womb, but that it is life and that it is human life is not even open to question. And then you just put aside real life and you go into politics. Roe versus Wade. No one knows when life begins. You know, now you know you're dealing with basically a group of, you know, octogenarians who are not talking about the real world and are echoing pure BS. By BS, I mean a denial of the world as it is in order to serve a certain purpose, right? So there it is. I mean, I think what makes the abortion debate, I think, for me, so poignant, and is just this. It's not even that it's a woman kills a child. It's that a woman kills her own child. Now, think about it. If it was an honor killing, we would be outraged. Oh my God, he killed his own daughter. And yet, even in the honor killing, the person who does it, the Muslim radical or the honor killer, feels that this person has violated the family contract. They've done something that has brought shame and disgrace on the family. They might be wrong about that, but they believe that the contract has been torn up. But no one can say that about the fetus. No one can say the fetus tore up the social contract. The fetus put me in a really awkward position. No, you put yourself in that position. So the sheer drama of what is going on, it can be hidden from sight, but I don't think it can be avoided to any morally alert person who allows themselves to think about the issue.
If the left has a narrative that the United States is rooted in racism, sexism, bigotry, and homophobia, that all disparities are discrimination, and then they are confronted with the fact that not all disparities are discrimination, that in fact personal choice has a lot to do with both group and individual disparity, if they're confronted with any statistics along those lines, their immediate jump is to, you're a racist. Why? Because the narrative has been challenged. Don't be that. If your narrative is challenged by a fact, maybe you need to adjust your narrative to fit the fact, or maybe you need to determine whether the fact is true or not. As also part of understanding your own principles, you do have to recognize that there are certain principles that are immutable. And this is what conservatism really is about at root. Conservatism, to use the G.K. Chesterton metaphor, conservatism is different from leftism in the following way. If you're a leftist and you walk through a field and you see a fence in the middle of the field and you have no idea why that fence is there, your first instinct is to uproot the fence. I don't know why the fence is there, I'm taking it out. If you're a conservative and you see a fence in the middle of a field, your first instinct should be to say, I don't know why the fence is there. I'm going to learn why the fence is there, and then maybe I will consider whether that ought to be removed. And that means looking at the lessons of history and recognizing that they have something to teach us. This has something to do with the conservative mindset, having a level of gratitude for those who came before, trying to understand the ideas of people who came before you, and determining maybe why those ideas have been durable, what was good about those ideas, what needs to be maintained about those ideas. When folks wonder why the conservative movement has such reverence for the founding, it's because the results of the founding are the greatest upswell in human freedom and prosperity in the history of humanity. And that is also true because the founding embodied certain immutable and eternally true principles, principles we have not always lived up to, but principles that were true when they were written. And this is Lincoln's point about the Declaration of Independence. When Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal and have inalienable rights, when Jefferson wrote that, he was holding slaves at the time. But Lincoln said that was an immutable, eternal principle that we didn't live up to. And it is our job to make those principles apply to everyone the way that they were originally supposed to. It was articulated as a high principle by Jefferson for a reason, even if he didn't personally live up to that principle in his own life. Those principles matter. And the conservative principles, the ones that really matter, are limited government created solely to protect rights that come from nature and nature's God. That is conservatism in a nutshell. The founders thought that was self-evidentiarily true. I don't think it's self-evidentiarily true. I think that it is an outgrowth of 3,000 years of Judeo-Christian history and Greek reason. I think there are long roots to this. If it were self-evidentiarily true, then everyone would believe it everywhere. But it was self-evident to people who have been educated in the precepts of Western civilization and who founded the country. So educate yourself about those precepts. Realize why those principles matter.
Many of you know that I love movies. If you listen to any of our programs or my podcast, big movie fan. And I'm especially a fan of war movies, and I shared this with some college students at a gathering in Washington a few years ago. There's a movie called We Were Soldiers, and it's the Battle of the La Drang Valley in the early days of the Vietnam War. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his men were surrounded, vastly outnumbered. The enemy was advancing and all appeared to be hopeless. Joe Galloway was there. He was a reporter with United Press International, and he was caught in the melee, and when the bullets started flying, the reporter dropped to the dirt. Well, in the middle of all of the chaos and the bloody carnage, there was one guy who stood resolute, a guy by the name of Sergeant Major Basil Plumley. And he walked over and he delivered a swift kick with his boot to the trembling reporter and said, "You can't take no pictures from down there, sonny." Then he gave that young man a weapon so he could defend himself. But the reporter rejected the weapon, said, "Sir, I'm a non-combatant." And that old crusty sergeant major looked at that young man, that young American man, and said, "Son, there ain't no such thing today." Well, as the story goes, that reporter put down his pen and pad, and he picked up that rifle, and he stood alongside his fellow countrymen, and facing unimaginable odds, the Americans won the day. So what is the lesson for us here in this room, Young America's Foundation? Well, my fellow Americans, we are surrounded. The cultural bullets are flying. The enemies of freedom are advancing, and the time has come for all of us to stand resolute. You say, Todd, but I'm not a fighter. Well, there's no such thing today, because we are freedom's last line of defense. So I say this: do not hide liberty's light under a bushel, hold it high. Let the flame of freedom burn bright for all the world to see. I believe it's time for every gun-toting, Bible-clinging, deplorable American to take a thunderous stand for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And may our prayer be on this day that our great nation will once again be that shining city on a hill. God bless you all very much.
It does give one a sense of disquieting unease. When you feel as though the ground is moving beneath you. When you feel as though you can't say basic things that are true. Things like communism is bad. Or a man is a man and a woman is a woman. If you say these sorts of things, then you are cast out of polite society. And that really means that there are stakes to this clown show. It's all dumb, but there are actual stakes to that. And that's why activism is really, truly important. So tonight I want to give you 7 tips on activism as you move forward into your college career. First tip, read. So I know everybody wants to be on TV. And listen, I've been doing this since I was 17 years old. I remember being your age wasn't all that long ago. Because there's so many media outlets, because there's such a hunger for conservative content, there is an incentive structure that leads people to get out there before they are ready. It leads people to get out in the public eye before they have fully formed thoughts. And that's a dangerous thing. I mean, as somebody who's writing a syndicated column at 17, I can guarantee you that most of my stupidest ideas came in the first 5 years of writing that column. People who are experts on a topic are people who have read 10 books on a topic. People who are qualified to speak on TV about a topic are people who have read an article on a topic. Be the person who reads 10 books on the topic, not the person who read the article on the topic. And this means listen more than you talk, at least for now. And the second tip is that you should understand your own principles. You really need to understand what you believe at a core root level. There's a lot of pressure in politics to sort of follow the leader. There's a lot of pressure to think like a person who you admire. And I've always encouraged folks that they shouldn't always just defend somebody they admire because they admire that person. Maybe the person has a bad idea. Now, I love Ronald Reagan. That doesn't mean that every single thing that Ronald Reagan ever did is something that I agree with. You need to follow the evidence. And that means that you should be constantly guided by new facts and new evidence that are brought to bear. If you're not changing your mind constantly, if you're not constantly rethinking and integrating new facts, then you're not doing your job. If your perspective is so thickened that nothing is able to penetrate it, then you essentially become akin to a leftist. And the third tip for activists, this one is very practical. Stay off social media. Stay off of it. Have a news feed on Twitter. Have a news feed on Facebook. Check Instagram. Don't post anything for the rest of your life. Social media ruins your life. I don't just mean this in terms of you post something and then 10 years later people come after you with something that you posted, which is the current sport. The virtue signaling by which people go back into the past, grab something, then use it as a club against you. No, it doesn't matter that you're high schoolers, by the way. They'll do it. It doesn't matter. I mean, it really has no relevance what age you are. As long as you are an enemy, they will do whatever they can to ruin you. It's not just that. It's also that social media contributes to a really ugly sense of self-aggrandizement. You think people are thinking about you all the time. A fourth tip, and this is hard given what I've just said, you need to stay open-minded to people who disagree with you so long as they are open-minded with you. There has to be a quick protection mechanism, and that is when you realize that something is a bad faith criticism, when you realize that people are saying things to you just to be ugly or hurtful or to attack your character, the curtain has to come down immediately. It has to descend immediately, and that's the end of the conversation, that's the end of the communication. The fifth tip is that, as a corollary of this, you should identify the purpose of each conversation. You have to determine whether it's a conversation that is designed to inform you. Is it a conversation that's designed to allow you to bounce ideas off somebody? Is it a public debate where the goal is obviously to defeat the person who is across from you or to destroy their viewpoint? Right? What exactly is the purpose of the conversation? As an activist, you really do have to identify this stuff in the first 30 seconds. Okay. The sixth point for activists is you must behave well. No matter what you purport to say, no matter what it is that you represent, understand that the best thing that you can do for your philosophy, this is true for left, right, and center, but particularly if you're conservative, where you're held to a higher behavioral standard than a lot of folks on the left. How you behave in public is how you are going to recruit people to your ideology. Maybe just because you disagree with someone, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily a bad person. That maybe they're actually a nice person. And that if you deal with somebody on a one-on-one level, maybe you have to rethink what you think of them in terms of character. Be the person who makes people rethink in your daily life. Be that person. Make sure that you're continuing to have fun while still maintaining good character. You know, the kind of fun that you have shouldn't be at the expense of anything except bad ideas. If you're having fun at the expense of bad ideas, that is a lot of fun. I try to do it on a daily basis.
No one wants to immigrate to a socialist country. The desperate people of Central America who come to our border are not actually refugees. They are economic migrants. They're lining up to come to our country because of our free enterprise system. Full stop. End of story. They come here for capitalism. They are fleeing socialism. They are fleeing dysfunctional, corrupt, crony governments. That's it. Not climate change. Which brings me to the situation in Venezuela, which is dire and getting worse every day. It is purely ironic that AOC, a Latina, is the leader of America's socialist movement, because no one knows better than Hispanics that these ideas do not work. The human heart desires freedom, and that includes economic freedom. Hispanics leave places like El Salvador and Mexico, where connections to government and power are rewarded instead of ingenuity and hard work. Places where dictators promise utopia, but have turned their countries into living hell. Not long ago, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America. It was considered the jewel of Latin America. Today, it is the poorest. And by the way, Chavez fans, the Hollywood boys who were cheering him on, they've never had to apologize to the Venezuelan people either. Today in Venezuela, mothers with professional degrees, this is a story that was in the Washington Post, mothers with professional degrees are unable to feed their babies, their children. They cross the border into Colombia to sell their bodies for groceries that they can't find or afford in Venezuela. I'm here to tell you that socialism leads to desperation. It leads to indignities. It leads to hunger. And it leads to death. You would know that if there wasn't a blackout in your textbooks about all the atrocities done in the name of socialism. That is the story of socialism, and that is the battle we are in right now. It is your job. It is your job to carry this torch. It is your job to be informed so you can help fight back and educate other young people who are being misled by teachers and professors and really dumb people like AOC.
We are told that we have marriage equality now, that gay marriage is equal to heterosexual marriage. But equality means sameness, okay? If two things are equal, it means that they are the same. If they're not the same, they're not equal. Are same-sex marriages the same as, equal to, heterosexual marriages? That's really the question. I would say no. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with value judgments or moral judgments. You don't have to think that the homosexual act is sinful in order to see that marriage equality is a nonsensical concept. These two things are different in a profoundly significant way. The union of a man and a woman has, in principle, the potential to create of itself new life. The union of two people of the same gender does not ever have that potential, and can never, and will never, and has never. Now again, even if you think that the two unions are morally equal, which is not a biblical thought, but even if you think it, you cannot say that they are equal in every respect, because they certainly are not equal in this respect, and this is a pretty important respect. You have on one hand a thing, which is heterosexual marriage, which can create people. You have on the other hand a thing, which is the homosexual union, which cannot create people. Now imagine for a second that you're starting a civilization from scratch, and you have no prior knowledge, you've never heard of marriage, you've never heard of the gay marriage debate, you have no political leanings, nothing. You've never even heard of the Bible. And you look around and you see that there are all different kinds of relationships, and many of them are great. But one kind of relationship has this weird ability and propensity and habit of creating new people. When you're trying to figure out what to call all these different relationships, don't you call that relationship something different? Something that signifies the incredible power and responsibility that comes with it? This potential of the heterosexual union to create people is largely why marriage exists. And it's why society has cherished and protected this institution, because it understood that a union which might create a person should be stable, it should be permanent, it should be protected, it should be faithful, it should be monogamous. Every study has shown that children fare much better in stable two-parent households than not. So marriage exists as the foundation for the family unit, and the family unit exists as the foundation for civilization. If marriages are strong, the family is strong. If the family is strong, society is strong. It really is that simple. So we see that historically, one of the most crucial and elemental functions of marriage was to create the basis upon which and the context within which children are created and born and raised.
So let's imagine I'm walking on the riverbank or on the beach, and I have a sandwich. I made it. It's my favorite bologna and cheese sandwich. And I'm walking around getting ready just to whip it out and uncork it and start eating it, when a guy comes up to me and he goes, "Hey man, I'm really hungry. Give me half your sandwich." And so I do. I give him half a sandwich. Now, I would say that this is actually a very virtuous transaction. Why? Because first, I am a good guy. I shared my sandwich. I feel good about myself, and rightly so. And the person who gets the sandwich is a recipient of a good deed, and so they feel a sense of gratitude and a sense of obligation, and maybe later if they have a sandwich, they'll share with some other guy. So it's an all-round, you may say, virtuous transaction. But now I want to run the same transaction, but run it through the government with slight modifications. So let's follow the same transaction. I'm walking on the beach, I've got my sandwich, I open it up, I'm about to eat it, hungry guy shows up and he goes, "I'm hungry, give me half your sandwich." Now let's say that I answer no. Now, in a sense, I'm not doing anything evil because it is my sandwich. It is mine to give. If he doesn't get it, he's no worse off than he was before. I'm not oppressing him. I'm merely not conferring a benefit on him. But nevertheless, I've said no. And now something interesting happens. I hear galloping, and here's Obama on a white horse. He shows up. He dismounts, and he puts a gun to my head. And he goes, "Hand that man half your sandwich." And so I do. And so the outcome is the same as in my earlier example. The other guy ends up with half a sandwich. But now let's follow the actual transaction. First of all, I am a reluctant giver. I was not going to give him the sandwich. I'm forced. I have a gun to my head. It's no virtue to me because I'd rather give up the sandwich than have my brains blown out. So I just chose the lesser evil. I deserve no credit. The guy who gets the sandwich, far from feeling appreciative, he feels entitled. "Oh crap, only half a sandwich. Where's the other half, man? I'm really hungry." In other words, he's entitled. And so what I'm getting at is the same transaction that would be a beautiful and virtuous transaction if it were voluntary and in the private sector becomes a monstrous transaction. In fact, if you look at this transaction of the horseman dismounting and putting a gun to my head, if someone tried that in the private sector, they would be considered an outlaw and sent to prison. If you show up somewhere, dismount on Fifth Avenue, take out a gun and force some guy to take out his wallet and give half his money to another guy, the cops will be all over you. And yet the same banditry is legitimized and considered to be noble because the government's doing it. Now, their use of force is no less than the bandit on the street. It's very important to realize this. Because ultimately, if you refuse, they will do nothing less than to shoot you.
Recently you said in the conversation that Aristotle got everything right.
Just about. Not quite everything, but just
okay, cool. Because yeah, I was gonna say I almost agreed with you until like the book 8 of the Politics. He talks about the legislature's job to provide an education, and he says something that the citizen, the individual, doesn't belong to themselves; they belong to the city. And it sounds very kind of Marxist in a way. And I'm just wondering, do you agree that it is the legislature's job to provide a common public education, or would a private education system be better?
A private education system is better in the United States, but in defense of dear old Grandpa Aristotle, I don't think what he's writing about is exactly Marxist. What he's writing about is an idea that has been lost, which are the virtues and the role of a citizen in a society, not necessarily the DMV, not going down to some awful bureaucratic institution, but the role that we have and the relationship that we have to our families and to our communities and to our state. And for Aristotle, your identity is within that place. It is within the polis. It is within the city. And we, in our hyper-individualism, want to pretend that isn't true. But even that has led to some pretty bad consequences. Even on that, I love the libertarians, but that ultra-libertarian idea of hyper-individualism does not help people. The individual is not born in a vacuum. He's not floating out there. We individuals have parents, and we have a right to our parents. We come in places. We are born, we live in cities, we live in communities, and this describes our world, and we gear our lives, hopefully not just individually, but together, toward a virtue, toward practicing the virtues, toward the habits that are the virtues. So in defense of Grandpa Aristotle, he's talking about an idea that I wish that we could bring back. Now, if you asked me today, shall the federal government in Washington tell us how to live our lives and what virtues to I'd say no. That whatever the legislature says to do, whatever the legislature says is virtuous, do the opposite. If you do the opposite, you're likely to be leading a good life. But that's because we have lost the moral language and the cultural underpinnings with which to talk about virtue. And it's scary because I don't know where we go from there. At a certain point, if we become so atomized that we have no relationship to each other, then we'll wake up and find that our society is gone.
Can I get a handshake?
No way.
It'll be afterwards.
We can shake our hands only because we're brothers together in this polis, in this city, and we're together living in the society for virtue.
Good question.
My question to you is, a lot of my friends, they go to private girls' schools, and I feel like the constant argument that I get with them is, oh, I agree with abortion, but up to when the heartbeat starts, or up to when this starts.
Sure.
And I guess defining what a fetus is to them really triggers them. So I was wondering what I could do to get around this and kind of rebuttal them.
Sure, so there's two arguments for that. First is the stage of development. When leftists call a baby a fetus and say that a fetus is not a baby, by definition, it's different. That's a stupid argument because a fetus is simply a term that identifies the stage of development. You know, it starts with a zygote and then an embryo and then a fetus and then a baby when it's born. But the terms for stages of development continue after birth. You have a newborn, you have an infant, you have a toddler, you have a child, you have an adolescent, you have an adult, you have, geriatric. I mean, it's just a term. I think that's a real one. It's just a stage of development, but does that stage of development mean that that baby is not a human? Is it a different species? Because if not, then the stage of development is completely irrelevant. That would be answer A. Answer B, if you're talking about the viability argument is just a humbling reminder to us, and I mean the entire human race, that we have not yet perfected the science and art of medicine. because viability changes. And it has throughout the course of modern medicine. We used to not be able to save a baby's life if that baby was born prematurely. Now, if a baby is born at, I think it's 23 weeks, we have a chance of saving that baby's life outside of the womb. So viability doesn't determine the humanity of that baby, because viability is on a spectrum that we as human beings are chasing. We are trying to develop technology that reduces the number of weeks at which we can define viability. And again, that has nothing to do whatsoever with humanity, unless your friends know something I don't know.
Thank you.
Sure.
You also said that the U.S. intervened, that the U.S. funnels money into other countries, right? In aid and things like that.
Right, much more than any other country in the history of the world by a long shot.
Did you also talk about how the U.S. intervenes in countries in other ways, like war, and that the U.S. is tearing up these countries? And
which countries
these are
in particular are you concerned
for? Okay, so...
You mean when the United States invaded Afghanistan to overturn the Taliban? Do you think? Well, because you're making statements that are not specific,
look,
so I want to get to the heart of your question.
Okay, but let me just, with what I'm giving you right now, try to answer my question. Okay, so if the U.S. is intervening in countries, and these
when we give foreign aid, we
have
intervene.
Immigrants that are fleeing. Where do you expect these immigrants to go when the U.S. intervenes in these countries that don't ask for U.S. intervention?
Which country? Well, yes, the Taliban in Afghanistan didn't ask for U.S. intervention.
I'm just leaving it as
I guess
an
they
open
did ask
general
for
question.
it when they
I'm
flew
not going to
two planes.
specifically narrow it down to any sort of.
I know you can't narrow it down because when you get specific, your point falls apart. In the general, your point sounds like it makes sense, but in the specific, it doesn't make sense.
You mentioned women that are raped when they cross the border, but you're not mentioning the children that are being raped in the detention centers at your borders.
Well, 80% of women and girls who cross the border illegally are raped along that journey by the sadistic sociopaths who have been permitted to run free along the border. What percentage of children who have been brought in by their parents to this foreign country, what percentage of children are you suggesting are being raped by U.S. government officials?
Where are the children in the detention centers?
Hold
There's
on,
children that went missing as well.
You made a claim, and I'm just asking what percentage of the children being, you said U.S. children in U.S. detention are being raped by government officials. Do you have any evidence for that whatsoever?
Government officials.
You said they're being
raped in detention centers.
By whom?
I never mentioned by who.
By whom? By whom are you suggesting?
Okay, but who's keeping these detention centers?
So you don't have by whom are you saying they're being victimized? If there is an epidemic of children being victimized in these detention centers, and you have some evidence of that, you better present that. That sounds like a terrible thing.
These children from their parents in these detention centers.
So children are separated from their parents, not because of a policy of Donald Trump, not even because of a policy of Barack Obama, but because of a policy that was determined in 1997 called the Flores Agreement during the Clinton administration. And the reason for that is that when illegal aliens come into our country, they are apprehended by law enforcement. But if they're held for longer than a short period of time, you can't put children in jails. I don't think anybody wants us to put children in jails. That is literally caging children. So the children are separated from their parents because the parents are dealt with by law enforcement and the children are dealt with by the Department of Health and Human Services. The only alternative to this would be to put children in jails or else to let the parents go free without any consequences for entering the country, which is to say the only alternative is totally open borders in the United States. Is that what you're suggesting?
So you're saying the children in cages right now aren't?
Which children are, how many children are in cages right now?
The children at the detention centers.
You're so certain of this. How many children are in cages right now?
The federal government received more than 4,500 complaints in 4 years about the sexual abuse of immigrant children who were being held at government-funded detention facilities, including an increase in complaints while the Trump administration's policy of separating migrant families at the border was in place.
There's also been a surge in illegal immigration. We now have 3,000 people per month coming into this country, and a surge in children. So naturally, any offense that involves children is going to increase. I agree with you. Illegal immigration is a horrific and immoral action, and it should not be encouraged by craven politicians who think that they can grab a few extra votes by encouraging the victimization of desperate foreigners and their children.
what are your thoughts when you talk about, that the EU makes laws without any consent from the citizens? So what are your thoughts on the UN?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, the United Nations is one of these well-intentioned organizations, just indeed as the League of Nations was back in, 2021. Look, I am all for international organizations where countries get together as friends that respect each other and you can agree some positions. What I'm not for are international organizations that morph into supranational organizations and then give the ability to make decisions to those organizations. And I have to say there are aspects of the United Nations that are very similar to my friends in Brussels. Too higher salaries, all sorts of ludicrous appointments, despots all over the world getting roles in human rights and all the rest of it. And as I say, the principle of the UN is a good one. The practice of it at the moment is not a very good one. But the highlight for me of the United Nations in the last few years was Donald Trump's speech there that he gave last year. And when anybody ever asks you, what is the doctrine of Trump, I think he laid out in that speech at the UN everything that he as a human being believes. His belief in a nation state, his belief in the democratic process, his belief that bureaucrats, be they in the UN or the EU or elsewhere, should never get above their station. So let's watch the UN like a hawk. It could be a force for good. At the moment, it's a force for bureaucracy, high salaries, and it's costing us a bit too much money.
How precisely does a biological male come to the conclusion that he is really a woman? How does this process work? If he arrives at this conclusion based on the fact that he feels like a woman, how does he know what it feels like to be a woman if he's not one? Is it not circular logic to say that he knows what it feels like to be a woman because he feels like one and therefore is one? That's a circular logic. That makes no sense. What exactly is a female feeling? Maybe some of the ladies here can help me out with that. Even if it made sense to speak of female feelings and female thoughts, and even if it were possible for a man to know that he was experiencing one, why would that mean that he is a woman instead of just a feminine man? We used to have those. Those used to exist. The left tells us that gender is a social construct. They reject the idea that women must necessarily have any particular feeling or thought or taste or preference. So if gender is an artificial construct, and our physical features have no bearing on our identity as male, as man or woman, then what the hell is a woman anyway? A woman in that case would not be defined by her feelings, her thoughts, her ideas, her preferences, her body, her reproductive organs, her DNA, her chromosome. Well, what is she defined by? What is she? Can anyone answer that? See, when a man says that he's a woman, he's now made it so that that phrase means nothing. It doesn't mean anything to be a woman. He might as well say that he's a who's a what's it or a thingamadoodle. It's just a word. It means nothing anymore. This is the real harm that this transgenderism nonsense has caused. Not only does it foment confusion in the minds of children, but it also cheapens womanhood by turning it into some kind of abstract concept that we theorize about. So you women in the audience, you're not even people. You're just these abstractions, according to the LGBT folks. Or, if not that, then womanhood is a costume that you can put on and wear. This is especially ironic given the concern for cultural appropriation that you find these days. If it is appropriation for a white man to dress like a black man, is it not appropriation for a man to dress like a woman? Why doesn't anyone ever talk about female appropriation? That is real appropriation. You've got women, you go to a drag show, you've got men dancing around in women's clothes, making a mockery and a parody of womanhood. It is like a female minstrel show. It is female blackface. And feminists just sit back and take it most of the time. Speaking of irony, the left for so long has tried to tear down gender constructs, but transgenderism only enforces the constructs that they were trying to tear down. We used to say that a boy who plays with dolls is girly, right? That's what we used to say. It was back in the bad old days. The way to tear down that construct is to say that, well, it's okay for a boy to be girly. Or you could say alternatively that it's not girly to play with dolls. But a boy with dolls used to be girly. Now he's literally a girl, we say. If a boy who exhibits womanly characteristics is therefore a girl, then those gender constructs that the left was trying to tear down, they have just made those constructs into something far more potent or powerful than any conservative ever imagined that they could be. That's why I object to redefining gender.
A lot of people of color are living paycheck to paycheck, and allows for very little room to move upward.
Yes.
How would you address that?
By less market regulation, by less regulation in housing, for example, let people build more housing, because that's what drives the price down, better supply of housing. By less government regulation and rent control, which leads to less supply of housing. By allowing businesses to start up and hire people without all of the licensing fees and taxes that are associated in the state of California, for example. With that, by getting rid of the minimum wage, because because the minimum wage puts half of the people who could get those jobs out of work. Right now, you put the minimum wage up at $15. College grads will be making the minimum wage, and all the people who are 17 jobs, they want to start working their way out of poverty, they will not get those jobs. No one's going to pay a 17-year-old kid to flip burgers. Right? It's not going to happen. So what you need is less regulation allows for more economic freedom, which is why in the past, when you had less regulation, you saw more social mobility. Social mobility slows as government sticks in the gears of the economy. This is why the inner cities, for example, areas that have been governed by very little social mobility, see permanent poverty, generation after generation, because no one is starting a business in the inner city because of regulations and taxes. This is what happened to Detroit, right? Detroit got completely cleaned out. Detroit was the industrial heartland of the United States. Through government subsidies, regulations, and high tax rates that confiscated property and wealth from the people who were generating it, all the businesses left. They raised the taxes again because they felt like they still owed people their money, so they raised the taxes again. More people left. They had no tax base. And so now Detroit is a center of permanent poverty and what looks like a zombie aftermath.
I'd like to start off by noticing that as each speaker gets up here, this speaker then goes ahead and answers, and his supporters get to go ahead and applaud. I would like to start off by applauding the people that had the courage to stand up against this hate.
You're certainly welcome to applaud anybody you like. I take no responsibility for who applauds for what.
Well, you haven't given them space. That was my point. But I do have questions here. What I was saying is the structure here has been very specifically designed to go ahead and to support a particular point of view.
Could you give an example of that? Because here's what I think happens. People come up and ask me a question, and then I give them an answer, and then somebody else comes up and asks me a question, and then I give them a different answer. Could you please show me the nefarious and unfair structure of that Q&A?
I'll be happy to, because after their last comment, you get a chance to comment, and your supporters go ahead and applaud. When the speaker is then going ahead and when the person from the audience is talking, you immediately talk afterwards, and there's no space.
Yes, that's true, because they're asking me a question, because I'm the speaker and they're the ones asking the questions.
Exactly.
Right. So I guess they can go give a speech somewhere else, and then their supporters can go and applaud them. But that's not what we're engaged in here.
So you do agree then that there was...
I agree that I'm giving a speech and people are asking me questions. I agree with that, yes. I didn't know that I had to clarify that.
So let me go ahead and, frankly, there's so much misinformation here, I don't even know where to start, but I will try. You talk about what makes America. There's plenty of things in this country that are a huge problem, and there's plenty of things in this country that are very good. One of the best things about this country is that as each culture comes in, we're able to go ahead and look at that culture and take on the best things from that culture. America is not a English-only culture. We have taken on from all different cultures, and it's the strength of this country that we have gone ahead and taken on. It's the strength of this country that you can't look at people and tell which ones are Americans and which ones are not.
Well, that's what I said in my speech. That's literally what I said in my speech.
What you said is you expect them to assimilate.
Right, I expect assimilation, and I said it's a beautiful thing in this country that you can't look at someone and tell who's the American and who isn't. I said the exact same line that you just said.
But you seem to imply that when people come in...
Well, you know what they say happens when you assume.
When you were speaking about that, you listed off a number of statistics showing that black people are more likely to get stopped by police because they have more guns. My question is, why do you think they have more guns? My personal view is that they have more guns because black people are poorer in general because there's a deep racial history in this country, a racial divide. That's my view.
Okay.
If you don't agree with that, why do you think it is that black people are, on average, poorer than white people, on average, more likely to get arrested, and et cetera?
Okay, so the truth is, and this is sad to say, but the black crime rate has been significantly higher than the white crime rate for literally 150 years. It's been very high for a very long time. The black murder rate was 10 times the white murder rate in 1900. So this has been true for a very, very long time. And the real question is, why didn't that ratio narrow right after the civil rights movement? Right? Because presumably things changed after the civil rights movement. So, and why exactly is it effect of white privilege when black people kill black people, which is the majority of people who are killing each other, right? The vast majority of black on black, the vast majority of black crime is black on black crime, right? It's not black on white crime. The reason that I would suggest that there is such high violence rate in the black community is specifically now because you have a culture where there are young black men growing up with no fathers in the home. The black middle class was growing actually pretty quickly in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s, a couple of different things happened that really trashed the system. One was the welfare system said, unfortunately, to black fathers and black mothers that you are better off if you actually don't stay in the home. You get benefits that increase if the father leaves, right? And then that creates an incentive to single motherhood, which is seriously problematic because the government can't be daddy, right? Only a father can really be daddy. And then, beyond that, there is a long history, and this has been maintained. And this is where I will agree that there is quote-unquote white privilege, but not now. So it used to be white privilege, and now it's actually a lefty argument. So the white privilege was, and this is true, that white police forces did not police inner-city black communities or southern black communities. So when black people killed each other, the white police forces just said, fine, go ahead and kill each other. Like, really, this is true historically. Right? White police forces did not police black communities, so there's a lack of law enforcement in the black community, and so people break down. This is true in any tribal society where you don't have law enforcement or any overarching justice system. Right? So it's not unique to American blacks. This is true wherever there is no real justice system. People tend to take justice into their own hands, and you end up with retaliatory killings all over the place, which is what happened. That was true all the way until the 1960s, and then in the 70s and 80s when the crime wave really started to hit, right? Between 1960 and 1994, the violent crime rate in the United States multiplied by 400%, right? 400%. And when that happened, there was a real crackdown. I would say that what's happening now is not white privilege. What I would say is that, Jim Crow created terrible systems of law, and those systems of law allowed cultures to flourish that were violent and problematic. And then that was exacerbated by the federal government getting involved and under-policing. And now, when we actually have a situation where the police want to go in and clean things up, now the left has insisted that not happen. So that's not, I don't count that as white privilege. I call it, my problem with the term white privilege as a general rule is that it's too vague. What I just laid out for you is a relatively specific narrative with actual cures. Right? White privilege does suggest that there's some cabal of white people out there saying, I want black people to die. I don't think that's true. Right? I think that there are laws that were on the books that are racist. I think there were racists who promoted those laws. I think those laws were basically wiped out in the 60s. I think those racists were basically voted out of office in the 60s. And now what you've seen is the impact of other unintended policies that have created tremendous problems in the black community, but all of which can be solved. All of it. All of which can be solved by individual responsibility. Individual responsibility, right? Don't tolerate crime in your own community. Work with the cops, ensure that your kids have fathers in the home so they're not gangbanging and walking around on the streets with guns.
I'm a conservative and I don't disagree with a lot, but one thing that I haven't really heard an argument to change my mind about is the wall. So I'm curious to see, like, from my perspective, I feel like it's a waste of taxpayers' dollars. I don't think it's like a racist thing. Like, I don't think it's racist to build the wall, but I think that given the fact that our country has a lot of resources militarily, especially in surveillance, that there'd be better ways to allocate those resources using to track people who are crossing illegally, maybe instead of building like $1 billion wall that we're probably going to have to end up paying for. So my question to you is, like, is the wall even worth it if we have like better options, you know, instead of having to pay for it?
The wall is worth it. The walls work. Walls are great. As a student of history, I've looked back at some ancient cultures, the Chinese, for instance. Even in the early modern, you know, the Vatican City has a wall. Meanwhile, certain people in the Vatican tell us that walls don't work. They're all hiding behind a wall. Israel has walls. They're surrounded by enemies. They have walls. Walls work. They work around this building. They work around our homes. They are effective. The amount of money that the wall costs is not terribly high. The driver of our debt and deficit is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. You are not going to put America on a path to fiscal solvency by taking a few bricks out of the wall. It just ain't going to happen. And by the way, we have a president who famously builds walls. That guy, I bet you, he'll be able to get the costs down 40, 50%. You'll be thrilled. Even if Mexico doesn't want to pay for it. And by the way, we have many mechanisms at our disposal to make Mexico pay for it. Let me tell you, they're talking about taxing trade or taxing this or that. That's fine. If you tax remittances from Mexican nationals, illegal aliens who send money back to their families in Mexico, if you put a tax on that or if you put a stop on that, Mexico would build the wall. They would all go, they'd build that wall in 2 seconds. There are many ways to deal with this. It's an important structure too symbolically because it shows there is a boundary. We will not tolerate people violating our basic laws. And furthermore, we don't want the military to be acting as the police. We don't want to do that. We don't want to be in a situation. We want our soldiers to be ready to go fight wars and to defend us. Also, as a matter of law enforcement, we have not been able to enforce our laws. This is a problem of the courts. This is a problem of the laws and resources in law enforcement. We have 2,000 people, at least, flooding into our country every day illegally. These are record highs, and they aren't going to change. It's because the economy is doing very well in large part. The only way to stop that is to make clear, one, we will enforce, sure, we will deport people who need to be deported, but we need a permanent solution. Because if you don't have a permanent solution, once we're out of power, if we don't build the $1 zillion wall that goes, it's 10 feet higher and it's look really big and beautiful, once we're out of power, the will much more easily undo all of those gains.
Okay, I have a second question. I'm sorry for my tone. Previously, I was just frustrated.
That's okay. I have 2 daughters. They talk to me like that often.
Thank you. My question is...
But I cut them off with their allowance, though.
Well, you don't have that ability here.
I know.
My question is about national security, because I do feel like the KKK and white nationalists are threats to black individuals in the United States. There have been multiple shootings recently within the last 10 years, and there have been an increase of violence against black people. And I wanted to know if you think that that's a national security issue and how you would address that.
Yeah, I think it's a national security issue right here in the south side of Chicago where you have a combat zone going on in Rahm Emanuel and everyone just seems to not care, or as well as in Baltimore or other places. And that's black on black crime. That's not KKK or whatever.
What about white on black crime? I'm
well,
sorry, but that's what I was asking.
Okay, well then, have you ever heard of Margaret Sanger?
You can't just give one example.
Well, Margaret Sanger and the organization that she founded since 1973, almost 17 million unborn black babies have been murdered by that organization. I think that's something that we should really be concerned about. The fact that the United States government gives $568.7 million to an organization that was founded by a white supremacist, a racist, a person that spoke at Klan rallies, that referred to blacks as undesirables and weeds. I would join forces with you in a heartbeat to say that we need to cut off funding to an organization like that called Planned Parenthood. That 50, well, I don't think we give taxpayer money to the Ku Klux Klan. Well, well, yeah, they have. The FBI goes after white supremacist organizations, but then I would ask you, why is it that nobody goes after Antifa? I mean, I think Antifa is also a domestic terrorist organization. I mean, look at what they have done at certain colleges and universities to prevent people from going out there and freely speaking. So let's call a ball and a strike. And so there are many organizations out there that we need to be targeting. But I will tell you, first and foremost, we shouldn't give $568.7 million to an organization like that. And if you do some research, I think between 50 to 55% of Planned Parenthood clinics are in black communities. That's a travesty.
Okay, I have a second question. I'm sorry for my tone. Previously, I was just frustrated.
That's okay. I have 2 daughters. They talk to me like that often.
Thank you. My question is...
But I cut them off with their allowance, though.
Well, you don't have that ability here.
I know.
My question is about national security, because I do feel like the KKK and white nationalists are threats to black individuals in the United States. There have been multiple shootings recently within the last 10 years, and there have been an increase of violence against black people. And I wanted to know if you think that that's a national security issue and how you would address that.
Yeah, I think it's a national security issue right here in the south side of Chicago, where you have a combat zone going on in Rahm Emanuel, and everyone just seems to not care, or as well as in Baltimore or other places. And that's black on black crime. That's not KKK or whatever.
What about white on black crime? I'm
well,
sorry, but that's what I was asking.
Okay, well then, have you ever heard of Margaret Sanger?
You can't just give one example.
Well, Margaret Sanger and the organization that she founded, since 1973, almost 17 million unborn black babies have been murdered by that organization. I think that's something that we should really be concerned about. The fact that the United States government gives $568.7 million to an organization that was founded by a white supremacist, a racist, a person that spoke at Klan rallies, that referred to blacks as undesirables and weeds, I would join forces with you in a heartbeat to say that we need to cut off funding to an organization like that called Planned Parenthood. That 50, well, I don't think we give taxpayer money to the Ku Klux Klan. Well, well, yeah, they have. The FBI goes after white supremacist organizations, but then I would ask you, why is it that nobody goes after Antifa? I mean, I think Antifa is also a domestic terrorist organization. I mean, look at what they have done at certain colleges and universities to prevent people from going out there and freely speaking. So let's call a ball and a strike. And so there are many organizations out there that we need to be targeting. But I will tell you, first and foremost, we shouldn't give $568.7 million to an organization like that. And if you do some research, I think between 50 to 55% of Planned Parenthood clinics are in black communities. That's a travesty.
So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led to these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures without taking into consideration historical, the history in general, conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here. But I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight from against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because, this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today, there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathology that exists in the black community, black inner city community, of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem. You know, this is a general issue that I have in all of my relationships. When my wife comes to me and she says, there's a problem in my life, before we even have the conversation, I say to her, is this a listening conversation, or is this a you want me to fix it conversation? And I think that when it comes to politics, there should be far fewer listening conversations, like, I want you to tell me about all the crap that's happened to you, because I don't care. I mean, I care, but it doesn't. But now the question is, what you going to do? Right? That's a much more important conversation, because we only have 5 minutes together. Is that 5 minutes going to be spent on all the terrible things that happened, which I fully agree with, that I would have fought if I were there, but I wasn't? Right? Are we going to spend 5 minutes talking about all the terrible things that happened to blacks and Jews and gays and women and Hispanics in the United States? Or are we going to talk about right now what you can do to succeed? Because I don't think that the rules are holding you back.
Now, if the question is, should conservatives protect our environment? Yes, of course. That's a wonderful thing. Conservatives conserve. But the left does get it backwards, and I will just draw this distinction. Conservatives tend to be conservationists. We like the environment because it's beautiful, and we like to spend time in it. We want to protect the deer population so that we can go hunt them, because we really like hunting them, and they're beautiful, and we like to have them on our walls, we like to see them prancing around, we like them on our dinner plates. That's very different than environmentalism, which puts the cart before the horse, which makes it seem as though human beings exist to serve nature in some quasi-divine way, rather than merely serve it up for dinner.
So what would be a proposal that conservatives would be in favor of, or would present, if you're not denying that global warming exists?
I certainly admit that temperatures rise and fall at various times, and that I suspect that of the myriad contradicting climate models that various scientists put out, one of them is possibly correct.
Okay, so if one of them is possibly correct, and if there was one way to fix that one possible correction, then what would be a proposal that conservatives would present? You know, what would be something?
Fix it from what?
I mean,
of the temperature increasing 0.2 degrees in 100 years?
If there's a trend that may lead somewhere, then if we were to agree on that, then what would
we do agree that a trend might lead somewhere, but lead to what? What is the somewhere?
I mean, increased global warming equals increased air pollution, which is...
Does it? I thought increased air pollution causes increased global warming.
Yeah, burning fossil fuels increases greenhouse gases.
Does it? I'm not totally sure about that, because the main graph that the left used to argue this point, the hockey stick graph, was shown to be a fraud within the last 7 or 8 years. Right? The main bit of evidence in that Al Gore movie was fell apart over the last 10 years. So is there a relationship between carbon dioxide and increased temperatures? Yeah, perhaps. I suppose so. I'm not an expert on it. My question isn't even that. I'm perfectly willing to grant that that's possibly the case, and it's even possibly from greenhouse gases emitted by humans. But what's the end game? What's the upshot? What is that going to lead to? What catastrophe do I need to craft a public policy to prevent? I don't know. If you can present that to me, I'm more than happy to engage in a serious policy discussion. But it's not just you. It's not just you. Nobody on you are exactly as expert on this as any leading politician on the left, which is that they huff and they puff and they say that some catastrophe is going to befall us, which is why we need to take everybody's money and socialize the government and take away people's political rights and take away people's economic rights because of the catastrophe that's going to happen. And then we say, what's the catastrophe? And they say, how dare you? You're denying the problem. Show me the problem, and then we can talk about a solution. But until then, it's not the right that is being unserious about this question of environmentalism. It's the left that's being unserious.
So next week, there's going to be a pro-abortion speaker here talking about how abortion is a moral good from a Christian perspective. How do you, how do you argue with someone who has such an extreme position about abortion?
Well, I have an extreme position about abortion, which is that it's bad to kill babies after they're born or as they're being born or just before they're born or really any time before that they're born. I think that extreme position is easy to hold and easily defensible. The question you'll have to ask is what that person's premises are. Because there are 2 points to that topic. One, that abortion is a moral good, and 2, that it is Christian to kill babies. I seem to recall some verses of scripture coming from, a guy named Jesus Christ, who talked about he'll hold you accountable for whatever you do to the least of these, you know, and tie a millstone around your neck, and it'd be better for, right, that guy. So I'd be curious as to what he says. I've never heard a coherent argument for abortion that did not also imply that it would be perfectly fine to kill other various human demographics. One of the arguments that cynical people make for abortion is that it's good because these kids, they'll all be on welfare and probably grow up and commit crime. And this is a very racist argument because everyone who makes that argument is saying that it's good to kill the little black kids, but you wouldn't want to kill the precious little white kids who grew up in the suburbs. And the question you have to ask him is, which young black man in an inner city would you be willing to apply that logic to at the age of 24? And look him in the eye, because they're never called out on the absolute racial bigotry of it all. In New York City, more black babies are killed in the womb than are born. That is horrific, and future generations will look on that barbarity with great moral opprobrium, and will look on the people who advance that with great moral opprobrium. And if this fellow is a Christian, then when he gets to St. Peter's Gate someday, I have a feeling that the eternal judge is not going to look very well on him spouting horrific heresy that has led people possibly of good faith astray. He will meet the millstone in the next world, and it would be better for him to correct his views in the present. All of that is to say, you should always take the level-headed approach. Do not, you'll notice I'm not yelling or screaming about this man. I'm not yelling or screaming even about abortion, even as the governor of Virginia says we should kill babies after they're born. Because the truth is on your side. You don't need to pretend that this is some passionate interest battle that is brutal and unreasoned. For him it is. For you it's not. So I would calmly rip apart his arguments, and then I would advise him to go have a quick confession and repent before the judgment day. You know.
Thank you.
Hey, so I agree with almost everything you said. What I wanna ask about is, I'm not qualified to speak on the morality of abortion as other people sometimes do, but logistically speaking, using the numbers that you set forth, the 1.3 million babies every year that are killed, if you per se outlaw abortion, what do you now do with those 1.3 million babies? Because I would assume that it's not two loving heterosexual parents that are financially stable and ready to have a child that are the ones that are having these abortions. It's usually, I think, single moms and stuff like that. And as you talked about, when you talked about marriage, that's not a good way to have a child, and that's not a good way to have children in this society.
Yeah, so you're talking about the socioeconomic concerns with abortion.
Yes.
My first answer to that is I don't care. Well, I mean, seriously, because that could never justify killing people. So even if you could show me in a crystal ball some vision of the future where abortion is illegal and we are all living in destitute poverty, then I would say, yes, let's do it. Let's do it now. Because I would rather live in a poor country that doesn't kill babies than a rich one that does. So, yeah. But I would also say, as to the socioeconomic thing, that yes, I think if we were to outlaw abortion across the country overnight, which of course wouldn't happen, but if it did, in the short term there would be an adjustment and there would be difficulties financially. Well worth the price, worth any price in my opinion. But in the long term, I think it would help our country socioeconomically and in every other sense. Because think about it, with abortion we have separated the life-giving aspect of sex from the pleasurable aspect of sex, and what that does is it encourages people to engage in sexually risky and irresponsible behavior more and more, because they know that at the end of the day they can always just get an abortion. If you take the abortion out, then over time people are going to be encouraged to be more responsible in their sex lives, and they're going to be encouraged to get married, preferably before they have sex. But if not, then once the baby is on the way, then get married then, like it used to be done. So I think over time it would have the effect of strengthening the family, which would therefore strengthen the economy as a secondary kind of benefit. So, thank you.
Thank you.
The Constitution protects my freedom of speech. We can all agree on that. And part of that free speech is speaking whatever language I want to. So talking about the cultural assimilation, you're saying that we should assimilate to a shared language, but what if I, a US-born citizen, does not want to speak English?
Well, if you don't speak English, chances are you wouldn't be able to read the First Amendment, so I'd be surprised if you would know about that right in the first place. There's a premise that a society has to have. The Constitution didn't spring into existence in thin air. It was dropped down into Thomas Jefferson's lap. He said, good, finally, we've got a country. We have a country because before anything else existed, I got this piece of parchment called the Constitution. That's not what happened. What happened is that our system of government and our Constitution and all of these institutions that came out of our Constitution developed out of a time and a specific culture. We inherited them not from 10 years before it was written, not from 20 years before it was written, but from the ages and ages before it was written. It is part of the inheritance of our culture. These are the premises of our culture. If one is to come in and say, I reject all of the things that undergird our Constitution, and in this very specific example, that includes the English language, then one is to say, I reject the Constitution itself. You cannot cut yourself off from the culture that has made you. You can do it for a very short period of time, and it ends in the political madness that we're seeing around us today. Sure.
So what you're basically saying is rejecting English is rejecting the Constitution.
I'm saying rejecting a common culture in the United States renders the Constitution meaningless. In the case of the English language, it literally renders it meaningless. You wouldn't be able to read it.
What if someone translated for me?
I'm a little skeptical of that translator. Obviously, I speak multiple languages. I assume people in this room speak multiple languages. I love reading literature in other languages. I like going to certain bakeries and speaking in French or speaking in Italian. That's a wonderful thing. The question is, How do we conduct ourselves as a country? How do we conduct our systems of government? How do we conduct diplomacy? How do we conduct the law? Beyond just the question of language, which is really a symbol of so many other cultural questions, what do we have in common? If we don't have a shared, we've already established that American is not a particular ethnicity. American is not a particular race. There have been so many different races and ethnicities that have been involved in the settling, founding, and establishment of the country. So if it's not a race, if it's not an ethnicity, and if we don't have a shared language, and if we don't have a shared culture, and if we don't have shared food, and if we don't have shared clothing, and if we don't have shared music, and if we don't have shared movies, and if we don't have shared anything, then what makes us American?